Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and joining me today is Shawn Wildermuth. How are you, Shawn?
I'm doing great.
Today we're going to talk about code cleanup. Probably something most of us don't do enough of, but probably should do more of. That's my guess. You can explain it all to us. But in the meantime, before we begin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Shawn Wildermuth. I've been an MVP since 2002, a Microsoft MVP since 2002, more appropriately. I've been running Wildermind since 2007, speak at conferences, pluralsight author, written some books. Just I've been in the community for a long time.
So, I've written code. I've got an app. It's running. It passed all its tests. The users love it. Why should I care about cleaning up? What's to clean up? The app works great.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, there's this old notion, and I'm not sure how true it is anymore, but back in the day, it was said that 90 cents out of every dollar of development was spent maintaining code, not writing code. And so having some consistency in what the code looks like, but also keeping the code in a clean state so that as people need to make changes, that those changes aren't introducing new bugs just because of formatting. The classic one of these is the one line statement after an if or a for, where it becomes easy to write a second line below it and not realize, let's say there's curly braces about, not curly braces around it. And so these sort of rules about how you're going to format code are going to help you avoid those sorts of situations. And based on your organization, you're going to choose what rules matter, what format is. So this isn't just about Visual Studio telling you what the rules are based on the C sharp spec or um, uh, the advice about code formatting, the coding rules, such that Microsoft uses. It's taking any of the rules that you're used to, or the format, or the intention, or whatever that is, and applying it across your organization, or at least across a project. We see this a lot in JavaScript projects where they get very into using things called linters. And when we talk about linting C sharp, this is what we're really talking about, a way of specifying the analysis of the code itself.
Yeah. So it's going to help with readability. It's going to help consistency. It's going to put in guardrails, basically, so that if I write some code, come back 6 months later, less likely to introduce errors, or you write code and I come back 6 weeks or months later to add on to it. We're all coding kind of the same way. Is that a big benefit of it?
Not only will this help you with remaining consistency in those projects, but individual developers don't need to necessarily know what those are. So these same sort of rules that are going to be in code cleanup also apply when you just format a file. So if you have someone come in that normally uses, let's say, 4 spaces for indentation, and your organization uses 2, when they do Control K, Control F to format the document, it's going to take those rules into account, just like an entire code cleanup will. So I've got a project here um, called Shoe Money, which is a little store I built about selling sneakers. And this is using some newer technologies like Aspire, but it doesn't matter because this code is just code. And so I'm going to show you some of the issues that this code base has. And so if we go into our orders API, we can see a few things going on. We can see that the indentation is sort of a mess. Um, we don't know how different pieces of this should be indented or aren't indented. The seeder itself has data, but it has members that are just named, private members that are just named as the name here. Maybe that's your convention, or maybe you might find other organizations that are using an underscore or are using Pascal case here because it's part of it. These are the sort of rules that might matter, so that when someone is looking at, like, come down here and they want to type something like context, you're going to be able to get a sense of what all the things that are actually private versus anything else. If I start having context, you can see how many things are actually have that context keyword in it. And luckily it's at the top here, but it isn't always, right? And so these are the sort of things that can help the effectiveness of developers, not just making your code look good. So if we open up the program.cs, we look down here, I'm configuring a connection string where I'm getting a connection string and just using plus to concatenate these. And that's certainly fine, but it's not all that clear what is happening because of the way the code looks. We probably would rather use something like the $ quote code concatenate or text concatenation because it'll read better. And so those are some of the rules that are much more about how you're writing the code, not just the formatting of the code. Because in reality, in most cases, having this here is just going to read better because you're going to know this is a single string and these are all the pieces. And so you're going to find a lot of these rules that are kind of important for not only making the code read better, but having your sort of implied here. And the last one I'll sort of talk about, and then we'll start talking about how to fix these, is over in my orders API again. And that is how do the namespaces are handled? How are the using statements handled? Those are two things here because certainly in some organizations don't like want the one line namespace, and in other organizations they want them all to be within a container. And how these are ordered and these are structured for the using statements are another sort of piece of that. You want to be able to find what you're looking for easier, and you can define how that actually looks.
Full namespaces are another option because you can now kick them all out of the individual programs and have them at the project level, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the different options you have for a lot of these things. So let's talk about where normally we would change these things. So if I go into options and I'm going to type in style because I'm really looking for the code style for Visual Studio or for C Sharp. And in this case, there's a bunch of rules. And what I like about this is it's actually going to tell you what the example is actually going to look for. So when someone goes to use a field, sometimes people might want to say, I want a prefix with this keyword because I find this reads better. I don't, but some people do. And you can walk through just a ton of these. And so let's take one of the ones we talked about, like block scoped versus file scoped namespace declarations. So you can see the namespaces there versus here. And if I have this as file scoped, go back here. If I create a new file, you see it's going to start with the file based instead of the block spaced namespaces, and that's just can be true for a bunch of things. If we go into C Sharp tabs, this is one place that it gets people because different people will have this option differently. I happen to have two spaces on my machine, but it may not be what the developer next to me has. This is especially important if you're working on different projects. So if you're a consultant, you have three clients that all have different rules here. We want to have a way of really dictating. And so what you can do is you can start right here. If you go back to the code style, and you can actually, once you set all these up to be the way you want them, or you can start from scratch, is you can generate something called an EditorConfig file. This is a file that is going to be checked into source control so everyone's using the same rules for their code. So let's go ahead and do that. And where we put it actually matters. In my case, I'm putting it as a sibling to the solution file so that all the projects adapt this within my folder here. These are based on folders, so you can have one for a particular project or one at your machine level or even at your mono repo level to define what these rules are entirely. But I'm going to create it here on my solution level, and I'm just going to add it here because we're going to want to look at it a couple ways. I'm adding it as a solution item because it is a solution item. And when we open this, there's a editor built into Visual Studio that allows you to look at and find the different things you want to do. So let's do some common ones like changing this, let's say to 3, even though my machine setup was 2. I want this project to have 3 character indentation. So whether that's the tab size of the indentation type, um, we can look for code styles in here. One of the things you'll notice is you can search for specific things. Of course, I picked the one that wasn't. Um, so I could change this between having new objects in my class when I auto create them to prefer them to be underscore, prefer them to be passive case, or even begin with an I. And so just like here, if I had a constructor, and let's just put a string name here. One of the things that's not clear that you can do is use this little I, which control period, that's how I normally pop it up. It'll give me that option based on that rule of how to create that. So fields, because we've preferred it inside our editor config, is going to say that's the one we actually want to create and then use in our class from here. Sort of things that you're going to see in here. But let's talk about, we've made this change. I'm going to save this for a minute. And this was the class that was kind of messed up as far as the indentions and stuff. But if I go ahead and format it, Control K, Control F, you're going to see that it's now changed it to be supposed to change it to, yeah, there it is, to 3 indentions instead of 2. It's a little hard to see because I don't have the icons in there. But it also, you'll notice, had fixed up where we had irregular indentions as well. Let's go back to the editor config real quick because there is another option that's very interesting to me, and that is usings. This is where we can do things like prefer the namespaces outside. There's also an option for the way you're going to format the using statements when you clean them. So one of the challenges here is, even though this editor can be really helpful in specifying a lot of the features of editor config, it actually isn't complete. The actual spec isn't something that Microsoft has defined. This is actually a file that was first used inside web development to specify these same sorts of things for JavaScript and TypeScript and CSS and all of that. So let's open this up with just a source editor. And you'll see the format is pretty simple. It's just name and value pairs. You'll see there's some naming conventions of .NET for stuff that's specific to .NET. You'll see C# for C# specific rules. And all these are read even if the editor isn't surfacing them to you specifically. And what we're going to want to look for is the sort. Yeah. So these two for organizing usings are very interesting because when we format a document or we tell it to change the usings, so let's go to this one. And if we were to pop open the formatting, this would normally allow us to change these in some ways. But to organize these by making them alphabetical and those sorts of things. But a couple of the options that aren't obvious is you can actually say, separate the imports into directive groups. And it does this by namespaces. So anything that starts with Microsoft will be together. Anything that starts with system will be together, maps, or whatever it is. So I'm going to change that to true. And I like to have my system directive, system.net or whatever you're using to be first as well. So let me save that and let's go back here. So when we format this particular document, you see it's done this. These are all in alphabetical order, but it's tried to break them by putting extra spaces so you can see which ones are from one package. Of course, not every organization is going to want that. I particularly like it. So
You're not able to do that in the editor config
editor.
body.
Yeah, these aren't surfaced for some reason in the actual, they're put in the file, but the editor itself doesn't have access to these. In fact, this third one either. The organizing of usings isn't available for some reason. That's some feedback I've given to the team that these should all be available in the editor. But if you look at the .NET coding conventions, they're going to map pretty well to the things that you could do in the options menu. The last of these options that I like to talk about is the file header template. So you can actually tell the editor config that you're going to use the same sort of header on all the files. So I'll just say copyright Wildermuth 2025. Use at your own risk. So I'm using a \n to create a second line for this. Now notice I'm not putting in comments, but if I were to create a new file, say in my API project, another file, it will automatically put that header now on every newly created file, and all the other conventions we have there as well. And so that's a lot of what the editor config can do. It can really allow you to figure out how you want to style. Now, I haven't talked about code cleanup yet, but all of this has been sort of in the buildup because the editor config becomes an important step to defining your rules, the way you want your project to be formatted. And if we look at our solution and right click on it, you're going to have an option here. Whoops. Yeah. You have an option here for analyze and cleanup. What this code cleanup allows you to do is actually run on the solution or on an individual project or on an individual file some cleanups. And so I can run the code cleanup, and there's two profiles we can use to do these rules. So let's go into configure cleanup first. And one of the things you'll notice is that there are fixers for a lot of the things we talked about. You're not going to want to put every fixer in here, but a lot of them are going to be important. You can change these and have two different profiles. Maybe profile 2 is more aggressive and profile 1 is the simpler one. And in my case, I've added a bunch. Remove unused variables, remove unnecessary imports, apply file headers, sort imports you're using, format the document, and then apply namespace preferences. There's a bunch of other ones here, and it can do quite a lot to clean things up and make fields read-only when they're not actually ever set. I could go through this list all day long, but there's a lot of really interesting things. Like this is one that a lot of organizations like add accessibility modifiers. And what that means is if something doesn't have a modifier like private, protected, public, or internal, it will assume it's private and put private in front of it because the C# spec says that without a modifier, it's going to be private by default. This will make it explicit. And so let's take these that we've set and let's actually run them on the solution. Code cleanup, run code cleanup 1. You can see it running. And now what happens? All of our files have been changed with multiple rules we had set. And even other files we may have not looked at that had things like unused variables, those unused variables will disappear instead of causing warnings. And so you do have to be a little careful on what you're changing here and certainly look at what it changed prior to checking it into source control. But I have never found it actually introduce an error with this stuff. It's always been really useful for me to clean up an entire code base and to maintain it. And this is one of those things that I'd really like to be able to run every time someone checks code in. Like this should be the last thing that everyone does before they.
And if you just want to see less, you can run the code analysis without fixing it, right?
Yeah, and they would give you what was found before you actually do the cleanup. That's absolutely right.
So that's a great way to test your own code before you go and move things around and change things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because a lot of these things like unused variables and other things like that aren't really about the formatting, they're going to show up as warnings normally anyway. And this is often a way to clean up all of that code that may just be dead. There's actually an option inside of tools, though this isn't set in the editor config, but you could certainly support that, and that is code cleanup under text editor. Run the code cleanup every time you save it. Which profile do you use? It's a little truncated because we're using bigger fonts. But this is a really useful one if you want to just not have to worry about running it manually. But every time you save a file, we'll just run the clean code up for you. Some organizations really like that.
Which will be a little unnerving the first few times it happens until you know what to expect, and then you just stop doing it. We save a file and a whole bunch of stuff changes. I can imagine I would maybe freak you out at first. That's a great way of telling you what the rules are.
Yeah, and this way, all the code starts to look similar to what you might expect. You know, I find that doing certain things to make this code cohesive or uniform is probably a better word, finding fewer issues just because the code looks the way you would expect it to. One of the classic problems that I run into quite a lot, though we may have already fixed it, is this idea of having single line if and for statements. That's actually one of the fixtures in there is to actually solve that. So if we had a if true var string equals foo, right? This is perfectly valid, but it's also something I really hate because it's very easy to add another line here and go, why is the indentation weird? This should just work. And so I've always done things like if it is a one liner, put it after, but if it's not, put curly braces. And that's one of the rules you can actually specify that it will alert you and fix. This isn't liking that I put a string name there. Name. I think using these tools isn't about, necessarily your day-to-day work, but I think you'll find that especially if you're working in different environments, different teams in our organization, that having that consistency within projects or teams, if not your whole organization, can be really, really helpful. And that's where, checking in this editor config on a project solution or mono repo level can really save the day for a lot of these things.
Yeah, and then it also, even if you're the only one using it, you fairly new to this stuff, you write bug code a year ago, and now you want to go back to that old project. You don't want to be confused what you look at. But the stuff you wrote when you were a rookie, so you could run the cleanup on that project, that old code. Now it looks the newer way and gives you the ability of a thing to just jump in and be more productive without trying to figure out why it looks so different and what the heck is going on, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of this stuff back in the day and probably now, people are getting from ReSharper and those sorts of tools, and that's perfectly valid. But the ReSharper rules back in the day, at least, didn't really transfer project by project. They were really a machine level piece, and either you had to reset them every time or import a common configuration file. And the fact that this all stays with the code to me is the big win. It's not something that we have to have every developer set up their machine for. It just sees an editor.config and just does the right thing.
I also wouldn't mind. I mean, I'm constantly going to my usings, right clicking, remove unused and sort, which, doesn't take a long time, but it's a context switch. And to have it happen automatically on safe would be awesome. And then the ability to just make it happen at the whole solution level by right clicking code cleanup, I think that'd be pretty cool.
And this is especially true for when you're just writing code and you don't have the namespace in your file and you need it. The editor here very normally, whether you're whether you're telling the editor to add it for you, or in some cases it will just add it because it knows what you're doing. It will follow these rules as well, so you won't get into that situation of them being amassed from code you didn't actually write. When I come here and I were to write something else that added a new using statement, it would just magically work. It would put it in the right place. It would be formatted in the same way because it'll follow these same rules.
I imagine you can do the same thing with XAML files. I mean, download someone else's code or a sample. I like
Yeah.
work on my XAML with methods, each of the element methods on a different line. Knowing most people don't do that, so I got to do Control A, Control Take, go up on every single XAML file, which takes time. So I should be able to run code cleanup on that sample, and it looks the way I want it to run at the very beginning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It just worked for a number of files. In fact, when you look at the editor config, which I think was open, nope, you actually see that this looks like it's only created for C sharp. If this had been a different kind of project, like one that used XAML, like Maui or one of those, it would have had rules in here for XAML as well, because you'd like your whole organization to use that same format. Are you doing one attribute per line, or are you doing one enormously long line? Or are you doing one per line with a page break in between? Like that makes the readability of the XAML and especially design libraries, styling libraries, so much easier to grok if it looks the same every time you open a different file. It's been a big part of a lot of the coaching I've been doing with new clients is like, this is kind of where we start. Let's make sure your code all looks the same so that we're dealing with the same level playing field when we're starting to work with your developers to try to improve their skill set.
And this is all just built into Vision Studio. You didn't install an extension. It's not one that one versus the other's basic functionality.
And it's not that new. I believe it's in 2019. It may even be in 2017. But this isn't new to 2022 at all. The fact that I'm using a preview isn't effective on any of this stuff. I just happen to always use the preview because I'm doing a lot of at the edge stuff that requires the latest version. But if I open the same thing in uh, uh, 2019, this would all continue to work. This is not new stuff.
Man, this is awesome. So I think you did a pretty good job of showing us how to use it and explaining why we want to. I think this is just something that anybody should just start doing and you know, pick the basic stuff like usings and file headers and start small and explore the vast array of options. And,
Yeah.
I'm sure it can lead to some interesting discussions over what we do versus what we don't do. But that's all part of, kind of learning what works for the team. I think those are good discussions to have.
As long as you don't spend more than 5 minutes arguing about spaces versus tabs. Someone just take charge and pick it.
Yeah, or underscore on the variable name. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on and showing us how and why to do code cleanup.
That's awesome. I'm super happy to show this. One of the little things I'm really excited about when showing people deeper parts of Visual Studio. It's one of those hidden parts that I think a lot of people don't end up hitting.
All right. This is awesome. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.